I've just reviewed Sylvester Monroe's review of his own return to the school of his youth. Is there anything you wanted to add to what you've said? I might ask you about your own personal feelings as you walked past those graffiti-covered walls.
Well, what's interesting about going back there, what's painful about going back there, is people talk about these communities and how people ought to pick themselves up by their bootstraps. They ought to do that. That was a community that regularly, routinely produced successful members of society when it had the support necessary to do that. And it pains me to hear people talk about a welfare state, people who want a handout. What communities like this, what black people have always asked for, is not a handout. They are citizens of this country. What they're asking for is equal access to opportunity, to education. Government has a role. And no one is saying that government can solve all the problems there. And part of that role is to provide a quality of education that means something. That school used to have that.
Why is it that government, that the Lyndon Johnson era, which is the time I would assume you were a student at that school?
That's right.
Well, what's different then? Why can't it work now?
Well, one of the things I think that when I was a student in the Chicago public school system, never one day in the 10 years that I was a student in the Chicago public schools did I miss a day of school because of a teacher strike or because there was not enough money to keep the schools open. Perhaps that was because the Chicago public school systems were then a majority white system. The Chicago public school system today is majority minority. And so now we can't find the money anymore.
So white power fled then, or at least turned its back on
It has turned its back.
Establishment.
It has turned its back. So at the question that Paul Solomon asked at the top of this piece, why should people, and people will say to you, well, my kids don't go to that school. I don't live in that community. What does that have to do with me? It has everything to do with you. This is a democracy. We pay taxes to distribution of wealth. Right. Shared wealth in this country is one of the foundations of this country. If we don't educate those children, we can't build enough prisons. We can't rebuild LA enough times. Everyone, I mean, I understand why this gentleman feels he doesn't have a stake in this society, but everybody will pay if we don't.
How would Mr. Kozol respond to Mr. Monroe's observation, which suggests that when the white man goes, so does the power?
Absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with him. In Chicago, nothing he said was overstated. A couple months ago, the Chicago school system, abandoned by white people, not just white children, but white business, everyone, had to start rationing toilet paper. Children now have to bring it from home. It's absolute apartheid today in Chicago.
The issue is more than just money. It's also an issue of control and curriculum, and what type of African adults are you trying to produce within that school system. I was in the Intelligent and Gifted Children's program. I went to Cornell University Preparatory. I was on welfare, Head Start, free lunch, free breakfast, forced busing for integration. Every single government program ever created, I have been participating.
Newsweek magazine. It must have worked.
That's not the point, because I talked about white people. That was why I was on the cover. They were not celebrating my academic victories.
Your point is made.
Right. So my point becomes, Phil, that how you design those programs. In all of the programs that I attended, all of the education that I had, college, public, and otherwise, nobody ever told me that I was an African woman. Nobody ever told me what the history of African people were. Nobody ever told me that America is business, and without business you will have nothing and be nothing. And nobody ever told me how to organize business so that I would be able to develop institutions in my own community. So now the sincerity of all of the programs and all of the education has to be questioned, indicted, and convicted, because the bottom line is that America is not and has never tried to produce African adults who are functional, self-sufficient, who understand their politics, their economics, and their relationship to the world politics and the world economics.
America is never going to America's never going to understand that as some abstraction. Communities understand that. You must give communities the power and the control, and finally addressing the whole point. You can't just pour money into a school. You've got to build up in the community the economic base to sustain the school. You can't deal with these problems in isolation and say, I'll have a good school in a neighborhood with no economic base and no jobs and no businesses. You want decent schools, you've got to develop the communities in which those schools exist so that you have an economic base to support them. You've got to develop the power politically so that the community will be able to control that environment in which the school exists and meet the needs culturally, value-wise, otherwise that community reflects. And that means that you've got to have power in the hands of that community as a whole. Not in the hands of education bureaucrats, not in the hands of social bureaucrats, but in the hands of the people of the community themselves.
There is a gentleman in our room who believes he has an answer to your very optimistic call for jobs and empowerment. The issue is race. We'll continue following this brief break for your public television station.